Oh, good morning. I'm glad to see nobody got too frozen this past week. So, it was quite a midweek, wasn't it? Yeah, we closed, well, we closed for the snow half of Monday, all of Wednesday, and all of Thursday for the cold. So yeah. And even on Friday, there were people who had trouble getting to classes. So.
Did you get any bird pictures on Wednesday and Thursday?
None of them flew into my house, fortunately, so no. So no, I didn't get any bird pictures. I just stayed in the and tried to keep the cold at bay. Oh. Well, let's open up with a prayer today. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you do look after those who are needy and in trouble, just as you looked after David. We pray that you would have compassion on those who have needs, that you would teach us also to have compassion on them, that in our actions they might see your Son. This we ask in his name. Amen. Amen. Well, we ended last time, I think we had read through the first part of verse 24 in chapter 20, where we talked about this sign that David and Jonathan arranged with arrows to find out about David's fate, with Saul. And the next section takes us to Jonathan in front of his father. Here, Jonathan is going to find out exactly how his father feels about David. So, could we have somebody start out by reading verses 24 through 34? The first sentence, I think, of 24 we read last time.
So David went in the field, and when the new moon festival came, the king sat down to eat. He sat in his customary place on the wall, opposite Jonathan, and Abner sat next to Saul. But David's place was empty. Saul said nothing that day, for he thought, something must have happened to David to make him ceremonial unclean. Surely he is unclean. But the next day, the second day of the month, David's place was empty again. Then Saul said to his son Jonathan, why hasn't the son of Jesse come to the meal, either yesterday or today? Jonathan answered, David earnestly asked me for permission to go to Bethlehem. He said, let me go, because our family is observing a sacrifice in the town, and my brother has ordered me to be there. If I have found favor in your eyes, let me get away to see my brothers. That is why he has not come to the king's table. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother before you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he must die. Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger on that second day of the month. He did not eat because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David.
Okay, so we have 2 days here. Apparently Saul has this feast on the new moon festival, but then of course on the second day Jonathan is eating with his father, and so they continue the conversation. So we get 2 days. Now on the first day, David might be unclean is the thought that Saul has. Now since this was a meal connected with the sacrifice and probably even involved eating some of the meat of the sacrifice, Saul is thinking, well, that's why he can't be here, because an unclean person cannot eat sacrifices. There are various ways to become unclean. For instance, if you touched a dead body, you were unclean until sundown. And keep in mind, they're not eating meals after dark, right? Light is expensive, you know, to have lamps burning is expensive. Everybody ate before the sun went down. Eating a meal in the evening was an unusual thing, you know. If the sun had already gone down, everybody went to bed. So he's thinking, well, maybe David's unclean. Maybe he's come in contact with a dead animal, right? So you touch a dead animal carcass, you're unclean until sundown. Something like that. So he's thinking, I'll see David the next day. So Saul doesn't necessarily miss David on this first day to the extent where he wants to say anything. But on the second day, when David's not there, notice he calls him Jesse's son. Saul's way of depersonalizing David. He doesn't call him David. He calls him Jesse's son. Puts some distance, in between himself and David. Obviously showing his displeasure with the fact that David's not there. And then we get this interesting thing that Jonathan does. His answer is clearly deceptive. David hasn't asked for permission to go home to his brothers, right? Jonathan is making this up to see what his father would do. He's following the agreement that he and David had that we read about last week, that, I'm going to test out my father to see how he really feels about things. And so he gives this deceptive answer, to Saul's question, but he does it to protect David. He's here, again, trying to protect David, who has insisted, much to Jonathan's consternation, that his father, Saul, is out to kill him. And so Jonathan's trying to protect David here to see how Saul would react. And what we find is that Saul's anger is transferred right to Jonathan.
He did have anger issues, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He certainly did. So he calls him son of a perverted, rebellious woman, right? Saul's not going to take any blame for the way Jonathan turned out, right? He's going to blame it on, right? What'd you say?
The woman you gave me.
Yeah, the woman you gave me, right, yeah. Right. Which is even worse.
Yeah.
Because it's God's fault too. Yeah, well here it's just the mother's fault. Son of a perverted, rebellious woman is his way of saying, you're just like your mother. I've had to put up with your mother all these years and now you're doing the same thing, right? This is what he's saying. And to his mother's shame, that she bore him, is implying that his mother should be ashamed that she even brought him into the world. She should be ashamed that she ever had this child. This is what he's implying to Jonathan. Very clearly, he's striking out in anger, and he's transferring his anger against David, who he's been trying to get rid of, and who he thinks is the one designated to replace him, and indeed who is the one designated to replace him. And so he transfers it to Jonathan. And notice the similarity with his attempt on Jonathan's life. Twice Saul tried to kill David with his spear, and now he tries to do it to Jonathan. He's unsuccessful all three times. But nevertheless, Jonathan gets the point. Jonathan now sees that David was not exaggerating things. I get the impression, at least, that when David and Jonathan talked, Jonathan may have not, I don't think he thought David was lying, but he might have thought David was exaggerating things. It's not as serious as you think it is, right? Now he realizes exactly how serious it is. That with the attempt on Jonathan's life, he says, aha, Jonathan now is saying to himself, it's not safe for David here at the court. So Now we have to turn the scene again to the rest of the chapter. And so let's read the next verses to the end of the chapter, 35 through 42.
In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David. He had a small boy with him, and he said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called out after him, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" Then he shouted, "Hurry, go quickly, don't stop." The boy picked up the arrow and returned to his master. The boy knew nothing of all this. Only Jonathan and David knew. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said, "Go carry them back to town." After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town.
Okay, so notice David bows to Jonathan 3 times. Now this is unique in Scripture, talking about somebody bowing 3 times to someone. Okay, so it very clearly is pointing out his respect and his lack of traitorous motives. Jonathan is the kind of the crown prince, right? And he's showing respect for Jonathan. And the one thing we see about David through the rest of 1 Samuel is even though he's anointed to be king to replace Saul, is he always respects the office of king. Twice he will refuse to kill Saul when his men urge him to do so. Here's your chance to do it, and he won't do it. He respects the office of king. He respects that Saul was anointed by God's command. And so also he respects Jonathan, who is, an official in Saul's court, commander in his army. David has great respect for what God has set up. Now, one thing that's interesting about David is he often is able to do the right thing and also the politically savvy thing at the same time. And that's what he's doing here. By respecting the royal family, not trying to kill Saul later on, he's actually saying something, right? It's not right to kill the king. If you kill the king and take over, what are you telling everybody else?
You can kill me.
You can kill me and take over too, right? It's politically savvy for David to do what he's doing, but it's also the right thing. And what we find often with David, at least until we get to the Bathsheba business, in 2 Samuel, is he often is smart enough to realize that doing the right thing, which is what he generally wants to do, is also the politically correct thing. Or if he has a choice of things to do, where there's not necessarily any right or wrong, he usually finds a politically savvy thing to do too. So David's no dummy. And so what he's doing here is both politically correct, but also godly. And one of the things maybe to admire about David is how he can figure out how to do both at the same time. Because it's not always easy to figure out how to do both at the same time. But that's what he does. So he bows down 3 times to Jonathan. And like I said, you can search the scriptures. You won't find anybody else bowing down 3 times.
The act of obeisance bears your neck
Right.
to the.
Yeah, because they get down on the ground.
Yep.
Yeah.
And your neck is bared, and it's a sign to the king that if you wanted to kill me, here I am. I'm just as vulnerable as I can be. And for David to do it 3 times was an offering to Jonathan, that if Jonathan wanted to kill him, he was completely vulnerable.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, he knows that Jonathan won't, but still, it's an important act. Did I see another hand? Yeah.
Do you really think that David had the ulterior motives of politically correct, or he was just following God's?
Well, I think from the preponderance of evidence, David is always very politically minded. So I think he knows how to do both at the same time. I think if you read, especially all the way through the book of Samuel, David knows what's politically acceptable and not. And usually tries to do both. In the Bathsheba incident, he tries to he fails because he does the wrong thing and he tries to do something that politically looks good. You know, and there he takes Bathsheba as his wife. Well, she's a widow. And one of the best things a king can do for widows is to bring them into his household and provide for them. It makes you look really magnanimous.
Especially if you equal.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, so David knows the political winds, and he navigates them really well. And I think he has, I'm not sure that the political thing is always foremost in his mind, but it's always there in David, I think. My reading of his character is, he knows the political situation and what's the politically savvy thing to do. He's no dummy. That doesn't make us what he does wrong here. Doing the politically correct thing can actually be good. I mean, we don't like politicians because sometimes, right, they do what they think is the politically correct thing, and everybody knows it's just for personal gain. David's not doing it just for personal gain. And sometimes, doing the politically correct thing can also be doing the right thing. So, politics is not necessarily bad, right? Even though it gets a bad reputation.
It's the politicians.
Yeah, well, they're politicians and they're politicians, right? But yeah, I think just from my reading of David throughout, the book of Samuel, he's pretty attuned to the political winds, and he's pretty attuned to what is going to support his kingdom and what isn't going to support his kingdom. He makes some mistakes starting with Bathsheba and following on as consequences of the Bathsheba thing. And there, sometimes he even has to be corrected. But generally speaking, David figures out a way to do the godly thing and the politically savvy thing at the same time.
And he accepts the punishment.
Yeah. So, the exchange of the kiss here, people didn't shake hands in the ancient world, right? Men exchanged kiss with men, women with women. If you look in Ruth 1:9, you'll see Ruth kissing her daughters-in-laws, right? This was not uncommon, and I give you a couple other places in the Old Testament where kisses were exchanged. This was common throughout the ancient world, and as late as the New Testament, Paul reminds his readers to greet each other with a holy kiss. Right, so in the church service in antiquity, when they exchanged the peace, it wasn't with a handshake. Okay, but the kisses were always men to men or women to women.
Not that this really matters, but like, my wife's family, Italians, like, the kiss is just touching cheeks. Not,
Right.
It's not lip to lip kind of stuff
Right.
we're talking about here.
It's
Like,
cheek to cheek.
When they say
Yeah.
kiss, they're just
Lip to
touching
cheek,
your
yeah.
cheeks to one another.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what was going on here.
Okay.
That goes on in Europe today.
Yeah, and it still goes on in some cultures. Okay, so this is kind of roughly equivalent to a handshake, but not really. And they would greet each other this way, and obviously here they're exchanging kisses on their parting, and in fact, their final parting. As far as we know, David and Jonathan never see each other again after this. There's no record of it in Samuel after this. So, you know, that is just a cultural thing.
It lives on.
Yeah,
In the apostolic church, that's how they greet.
yeah, in the apostolic church, right. This is what Paul says when he says, greet each other with a
I
holy
mean,
kiss.
today's apostolic,
Oh, yeah, well, that may be. There are,
greet each other with kisses.
yeah. So, you know, that seems kind of strange to our culture because we do handshakes, right? But this is what they did. This is the third time in this chapter that the covenant between Jonathan and David is mentioned. Okay, obviously, it's very important to their relationship in this chapter. It's mentioned before this when they make it, and it's mentioned after this, after Jonathan's death, when David keeps his side of the covenant. But it's not mentioned a lot elsewhere, I don't think anywhere else in the book of Samuel. But in this chapter, it's mentioned 3 times. And it clearly is important to the author to highlight this as their relationship. It's not just a relationship of, you know, their kindred spirits, but it's also a formal relationship that flows out of the fact that they're kindred spirits. And so 3 times it's mentioned here in this chapter, and it won't be mentioned again, I don't think, until 2 Samuel when David actually keeps his promise to Jonathan. And at that point, Jonathan will be dead, and yet David still feels bound to keep his promise to Jonathan. So this whole chapter emphasizes this bond between them that has been formalized and which both men feel an obligation to keep. And here Jonathan is keeping his side of the obligation. And they are to protect one another and one another's children as part of this obligation. And so we see Jonathan doing his side here. We'll see David doing his side in 2 Samuel. If you read on, you'll finally find it. We're told Jonathan returns to the city. It's not named, but it's probably Gibeah. This is Saul's hometown where he held court. And so it's probably, you know, just outside of Gibeah somewhere that they're doing this thing with the arrows and saying goodbye to one another. And so with the notice that Jonathan returns to Gibeah, that's kind of the end of their interaction with one another forever, apparently. And so Jonathan is back in Saul's court. David is forever out of Saul's court. He'll never be in Saul's court again.
Can you estimate how old they might be at this point?
David is in his early 20s. Jonathan is probably in his early 40s. So Jonathan's considerably older than David.
And how much longer does Jonathan live then?
A couple years, 3 years maybe. Again, there's, I think, it says 16 months between Samuel's death and the death of Saul and Jonathan. And there's some things that have to happen before Samuel dies. Samuel's still alive at this point. So probably 3 years, somewhere in that area.
Did Jonathan have any siblings? Were there other children?
Yes, yes.
How come they were not expected to be, Jonathan was assumed to be the next king after Saul, or?
Yeah, Jonathan apparently is the eldest.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but yeah, he has at least 4 sons.
Do we know what happened with them, or were they involved with this?
We do some of them, not all of them. So Jonathan and one of his brothers is killed at the same time Saul is killed at the end of 1 Samuel. Another one of his sons is assassinated in 1 Samuel, I think it's 3 or 4. We read about his assassination. But I don't think we know about what happened to all of his sons. Yeah. So yeah, Saul has other sons. And probably all of them are older than David. Saul at this point's gotta be 60, something like this. Anything else? Yeah.
Does Saul keep trying to kill Jonathan? Or
No,
do they have
as far
any
as we
kind
know,
of
he doesn't
relationship?
try to, as far as we know, he doesn't try to kill Jonathan again. Yeah. And in fact, Jonathan's gonna be with him up to the very end.
We have any idea how Saul's obsession with David affected his ability to be king, to govern?
Well, yes, we do, because as we will see in subsequent chapters in 1 Samuel, there are a lot of people who are disaffected with Saul's government, and they end up joining David as he's on the run from Saul. So all these disaffected people come over to David's side, and David ends up with you might call it a mercenary army, under his command. So yeah, it does affect his ability to rule, and it's the reason why eventually David is going to be able to become king of the entire land. Clearly, David's tribe is the most disaffected with Saul. When David, after Saul's death, David becomes king of the tribe of Judah. Right away, they accept him as king. The other tribes take a little bit longer. So yeah, there's indications that Saul is losing his grip on power as things go on.
Do you think it's significant that the first king is from the tribe of Benjamin?
Yeah, I do think it is. Benjamin is probably the smallest of the tribes, and God had already prophesied that the tribe of Judah was going to be the big royal tribe. And when the people asked for a king, earlier we saw this, if you were in previous years when we were working through Samuel, we saw this, the previous asked for a king, give us a king like the nations, right? Well, that's what God does. And they would have chosen badly. They wouldn't have chosen the tribe that God had already prophesied to be the royal tribe, Judah. They would have chosen somewhere else. And so Benjamin, he gave them a king like the nations would have chosen. It's interesting that when God refers to his choice of David, he never refers to David as, well, I gave him King David because they asked for a king. He says with David, I chose a man after my own heart. Right? So God's choice of David is different. He gives them their choice, like they asked for. Oh, give us a king like the nations. Okay. Saul, big strapping fellow, he can lead us out in the battle, right? He looks like a leader of men. He's got an imposing stature, you know, and so God chooses that kind of king for them. David, not so much. He doesn't, you know, he's not described in terms like that. And remember, in antiquity, the generals go out and fight with the troops. It's not like nowadays. You know, the generals are out there and they're vulnerable to be killed too. You know, and kings go out and fight with their armies, and we read about kings going out and fighting with their armies in the rest of the Old Testament. King Ahab is killed in battle. Later on, you know, he's shot by archers and dies. So, you know, having a big, impressive fellow who can hold his own in battle is kind of what you would choose if you were choosing like the nations. So yeah, I think it's kind of like they would have chose unwisely. They wouldn't have chose, and you know, it's interesting, Judah is one of the bigger tribes, right? If you were choosing wisely, you'd probably choose somebody with a pretty good constituency to unite the 12 tribes. So you would have chosen somebody from one of the bigger tribes, Judah, Ephraim, Manasseh. You probably wouldn't go to one of the little tribes like Benjamin. Not going to have a big constituency. And you wouldn't go to the tribe of Benjamin that had nearly been wiped out back in the book of Judges. Right. You know, but God says, well, the nations don't always choose wisely for their kings. So I'll give them that's what they ask for, a king like the nations, that's what they'll get.
There's nobody that, the other tribes would not be jealous of Benjamin.
Yeah, that's true, there's not a lot to be jealous of.
Manasseh's Ephraim and Judah, it's going to have a problem there.
Yeah, true enough.
But they do describe David as being handsome, and then there's something about his eyes. What does
Yeah,
that mean?
yeah. Well, who knows what that means, but yeah. Who knows what that means? He's ruddy, which I don't know if that means he has, you know, reddish tan skin from being out with the sheep, or whether artists have taken it to mean he has red hair. Traditionally, he's depicted as having red hair in art, but we don't know exactly what that means. Yeah, he is described as being a handsome fellow. But he's not described in Saul's terms of being, you know, he's a head taller than everybody else. And Saul was probably pushing 6 feet when your average Israelite was probably about 5'5". The men were 5'5". Okay, so Saul's an impressive fellow to them. You know, he would have played center on the Benjamin basketball team.
I always thought it was interesting, and I think you touched on this during the last set of classes, that for Jonathan, or for David to kill Goliath with a sling, being that Benjamin was the tribe known
with slingers, yeah.
for the slingers, which is where Jonathan, or where Saul was from. So for David to do that was kind of that connection, or that, you know, I know that I thought that was.
Yeah, well, that is part of the irony here, right? Benjamin is known for its skilled left-handed slingers. Okay, and it's fact it's said at one point in the Bible that these slingers could sling a stone at a hair and hit it. Okay, that's pretty good accuracy, right? And there's also an irony there in that they're left-handed slingers. You also have this judge from Benjamin, Ehud, who is left-handed. And it's a big irony because Benjamin means son of my right hand. So God has a sense of humor, okay, that he creates these left-handed Benjaminites. But yeah, you know, the whole David and Goliath thing shows Saul's failure. If there's one tall guy you'd send out to go against their tall guy, it would be Saul, right? And if you're going to go out and kill him with a sling, it should be a Benjaminite. Well, that's Saul, right? But the irony is, it's not the tallest guy, it's not the Benjaminite skilled slinger, it's David, who's from the tribe of Judah. So yeah, I mean, there's ironies all over the place in that story. Okay? The other handout, well, I forgot to ask somebody to print it out, so we'll get it printed out for next week. Judy will be back, so. She's my go-to gal for that, so, but you'll just have to follow along. We get an interesting story here of David at a city called Nob in the first part of the chapter, and then David at Gath. Now, Nob is a unique name for a city, but Gath is not. There are a number of Gaths. And because Gath means press, it can be a wine press or an olive press. So there are a number of places called Gath, like Gath Hefer, okay, or Gethsemane, which means olive press, on the Mount of Olives, right? The name of the town Gath does not particularly stand out until we realize this is going to be the Philistine Gath, not one of the Israelite Gath cities, but the Philistine Gath city. So David is going to be at Nob, and then he's going to go to the city of Gath. So let's start out with David fleeing from Saul. On the map here now, just to help you out, okay, he's going from Gibeah to Nob, not very far away, okay, and then he's going to find himself over here at Gath, which is one of the Philistine cities. Okay, so that's what's going on, and if you have that map I handed out, things are numbered. So he's going from number 3 to number 4, okay? And so Nob is not very far away. Let's read about Nob. It's the first 9 verses in chapter 21.
David went to Nob to Ahimelek the priest. Ahimelek trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelek the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find." But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women." David replied, "Indeed, women have been kept from us, as usual, whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?" So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. Now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg, the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd. David asked Ahimelek, "Don't you have a spear or sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon, because the king's mission was urgent." The priest replied, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one." David said, "There is none like it. Give it to me." Okay, so Nob and Benjamin
More
here.
deception.
Pardon?
More deception.
Yeah, more deception. Yeah, but Nob and Benjamin here is not far from Jerusalem. Okay, so, and it's not far from the last place David was at Gibeah either. Okay, and Nob is mentioned only 2 other times in the Old Testament. I've got them both up there. It's mentioned by Isaiah, and it's mentioned in the book of Nehemiah.
So apparently Nob is resettled after they come back from the captivity in Babylon. So it continues even after the Babylonian captivity to be a place where the Israelites settled. Now, Ahimelek is the brother of Ahijah. Ahijah is mentioned at 14:3, and then again in verses 18 and 19 in chapter 14, as the high priest. And apparently, what we have here is Ahijah has died, and his brother Ahimelek has taken over as high priest. Why it didn't go to a son of Ahimelek, I don't know. Maybe they weren't old enough to be priests. You had to be 30 years old to serve as priest. And so maybe they weren't old enough, and so Ahijah dies, and Ahimelek takes over from his brother as high priest. Now, as Hank pointed out, we have more deception. David lies to save his life here in verse 2, just as Michal, his wife, had done to save him, and just as Jonathan had done to save him. So all three of these people are deceptive in order to save David's life. And again, it doesn't seem to be condemned by the writer.
I'm sorry, what is the lie? I didn't fully catch it.
I'm on a commission from the king.
No way.
You know, he's not on a mission from the king.
Kill him.
You know, and he's not even commanding a bunch of men at this point. He's out on his own. Okay, but he's acting like he's doing this. Now, what's interesting here is Ahimelek. Notice he's not that far away from Gibeah, but yet he doesn't know what's going on in the royal court. I discussed this last week. You know, there's no CNN. You know, you can't follow this on Yahoo. Okay, people often in neighboring towns don't know what's going on in the next town unless they have relatives there or bring them news eventually or something like that. Very few things get nationwide attention in Israel. Things do happen that get nationwide attention, but it takes a while for the news to travel. They don't have newspapers even. You know, they don't even have what we had back in the 17th century with newspapers, like Benjamin Franklin Publishing or something like that.
I mean, so that being said, when does David know that he's gonna feel safe? How far does he have to go from Saul to feel like he's...
Well, eventually he's going to end up, and most of those places on your map, you notice, are south of here. Okay, well, I don't have a map up there, but he's going to go to Judah, where he can count on having kinsmen, people that are going to be somewhat, yeah.
South of the Dead Sea?
No, not south of the Dead Sea, just those points on the map that are south of Nob.
Oh, okay, thanks.
That's all Judah, basically. So he's going to spend most of his time in Judah, where he can count on the sympathy of many of the people, because that's his tribe, and so that's where he's going to go.
So which begs the question for me is like, why doesn't he just go there first? Why even spend time anyplace else?
Yeah, well, the first thing he tries to do is get out of the country altogether, right? So after this, he's going to go to Gath, controlled by the Philistines, because Saul's reach doesn't extend there at all. Okay, but we're going to find out that doesn't work too well, because news does travel around, and there has been news of some things, but notice the recent events haven't even made it to Nob yet. The events of the last week or whatever it was, right, haven't made it to Nob yet. And so David can make this story up out of whole cloth about why he's here, and Ahimelek doesn't know any better.
I guess it's also possible, you know, if Saul found out he wasn't in Judah, he might come down there and cause trouble amongst some of his family, so that might not be a good idea either.
Right, and David's going to have to, in coming chapters, David's going to have to worry about that too, as we'll see. Okay. So, yeah. Yes, that's gonna come up in the next chapter. So yeah, it's a parenthetical comment here, right?
Because it's like out of the blue, all of a sudden, there's a servant.
Yeah. All of a sudden, there's Doeg, and what's he doing here? It's because of what Doeg does in the next chapter, or the next chapter, that he's mentioned here.
What's the whole bread issue? What is regular
Okay.
bread, consecrated bread?
Yeah, what's the bread issue here? Okay, well, in fact, I think that I have that coming up. There, next slide. Good question. You anticipated where we're going. The holy bread is also the bread of the presence. So 12 loaves are placed on a table in the tabernacle each Sabbath. One for each tribe of Israel. This is unleavened bread. There's a table in the tabernacle, and the priest puts the bread out on the table every Sabbath. Okay, they're very large because each is made with 12 cups of flour. Wow, these are big loaves of bread. Okay, even unleavened bread, that still makes a pretty big loaf of bread. Okay, and they're to be eaten by the priest in the holy place of the tabernacle after 1 week. So they're put out on the Sabbath. The next Sabbath they put out the new warm bread, and they take the other 12 loaves, and normally they are eaten only by the priests.
So the priests eat it all week, and then if there's some left over?
No, they don't eat it. It sits on the table for a week. They eat week-old bread.
In one day?
No, they don't have to eat it all at once. But there are a number of priests, so it's not going to last forever. But they don't eat all at once necessarily.
So this is some of what was left over?
Right. This is leftover bread. And the high priest is saying, I've got